3 months before everything unraveled. I was just trying to keep my life simple, predictable, nothing dramatic, nothing that would ever end up as some viral story about revenge or luxury fashion scandals. I run a place called Red Mesa Feather Ranch out on the Colorado Plains, 50 acres of open land where the wind never really stops and the horizon looks like it goes on forever if you stare at it long enough. I raise ostriches there, and I know how that sounds to most people. A little unusual, maybe even a joke at first, until they actually see them up close, 8 feet tall when they stand fully alert, eyes that look way too aware for something people like to call livestock, legs that can outrun most vehicles if they really want to, and a presence that makes you respect distance in a way you don't question twice. These birds aren't just animals I take care of, they're the entire foundation of my work. Because the feathers they produce are not ordinary materials, they're the kind of luxury input that ends up on couture runways, stage costumes, and high-end fashion pieces that people spend more on than most people make in a year. Every single plume takes time, months of feeding cycles, careful handling, controlled environments, and a kind of patience that doesn't really translate into spreadsheets or investor presentations. Not far from my ranch, close enough that we occasionally see each other's trucks on the same road, sits Maison Balan, a fashion house that built its entire reputation on what they like to call ethical luxury. From the outside, it's almost absurdly perfect. Glass architecture, clean white interiors, staff that look like they were selected as much for image as skill, and a brand identity that screams sophistication in every direction. For a long time, my main contact there was a designer named Clara Venn, someone who actually understood the difference between marketing language and real craftsmanship. She treated my work with respect, and more importantly, she paid for it fairly. For almost 18 months, our relationship worked in a way that felt almost rare in this industry. I supplied premium feathers. She turned them into pieces that got featured in magazines and runway shows, and both sides benefited without anyone trying to squeeze the other side dry. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and in business that already puts you ahead of most people. Then Dorian Kessler arrived, and everything started shifting in ways you notice slowly at first, like pressure building before a storm. He wasn't a designer, not someone with any background in the actual craft. He was an investor type, the kind who talks more about efficiency than beauty, more about scaling than sourcing. The first time he came to my ranch, he didn't really look at the animals the way most people do, with curiosity or even admiration. He looked at them like inventory waiting to be optimized. He walked the perimeter of my operation, asked a few questions, then quickly moved to what he really came for, changing the terms of our agreement. He slid a contract across my desk that cut my prices by 70% and doubled the volume he expected from me, like the value of everything I had built could just be rewritten with a pen and a signature. I remember him picking up one of my best feathers between 2 fingers, holding it like it was something disposable, and saying, "Feathers are feathers. The market doesn't care about sentiment." I tried to explain to him what goes into producing something like that: the feeding schedules, the environment control, the time, the loss rates, the fact that quality isn't just a switch you flip when demand increases. He smiled like I was being sentimental, like I was speaking a language that didn't belong in modern business. When I refused his terms, he told me I had 2 choices: adapt or get replaced. So I chose neither of his options, and instead I started rebuilding my buyer network. Within a week, I had 3 European fashion houses willing to pay full price. No discounting, no pressure tactics, no middle ground negotiations designed to squeeze value out of labor. That should have been the end of it. A clean separation between 2 ways of doing business. But it wasn't, because not long after that, things started disappearing. At first, it was subtle. A few graded feathers missing from inventory logs, small enough to question, easy enough to dismiss as error or miscounting. But then it escalated. Entire sealed shipments vanishing right before Mays and Vaillan's major production deadlines. That's when I installed surveillance across key areas of my processing facility, something I never thought I'd need to do in a place like that. And what those cameras captured changed the entire direction of everything that followed. When I first saw the footage, I honestly just sat there staring at it longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand what I was looking at, but because a part of me didn't want to accept how deliberate it was. It wasn't random loss. It wasn't inventory confusion. It wasn't any of the excuses people usually hide behind when things go missing in a business. It was Dorian Kessler, moving through my facility at night like he already belonged there, with a small crew of people I recognized from Maison Valen's logistics team, loading sealed bags of graded feathers into their van like it was just another supply run. Calm, organized, practiced, like they had done it before, and fully expected no one to question it. I remember replaying one specific moment over and over, where one of them hesitated for half a second, looking back toward the storage doors, and Dorian just waved him forward like there was nothing to worry about. That part stuck with me more than anything else. Not even the theft itself, but the confidence behind it, like they had already rewritten the rules in their own heads and assumed I would eventually catch up. I confronted him the next morning, and I went in expecting at least some kind of denial. Maybe anger? Maybe an attempt to justify it badly enough that I could argue back. But what I got was something completely different. Almost worse in a way because it removed any illusion that we were living in the same version of reality. He didn't even try to hide it. He leaned back like I was interrupting his day and said those feathers were just sitting unused, that his company was simply unlocking value, that I wasn't taking advantage of fast enough. I told him those unused feathers represented months of labor, controlled breeding cycles, and carefully timed harvesting that couldn't just be replaced by force or shortcuts. He shrugged, literally shrugged, and then he said the line I still remember clearly, like it was some kind of business philosophy instead of an admission of exploitation. Feathers are feathers. You're overcomplicating something the market has already simplified. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity that the rules I thought we were operating under didn't actually exist for him. I told him to return everything they had taken and to stay off my property permanently. He smiled like I was being dramatic and said I should be grateful, because exposure from Maison Valen would do more for my ranch than any small supplier contract ever could. That was when I realized this wasn't just theft in the legal sense. It was something closer to erasure, like they were trying to rewrite the meaning of my work while still using it. After that, I didn't sleep properly for a while, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew exactly what I was capable of doing if I stopped thinking in conventional terms. Around that time, Clara Vin reached out again, but this time it wasn't a casual business check-in. Her voice sounded different, quieter, like she was speaking from inside a place that was starting to collapse. She told me Dorian had fully taken control of supply chain decisions and that the upcoming Maison Valen runway show was built heavily on materials that weren't properly accounted for anymore. She didn't say stolen, not directly, but she didn't need to. I could hear it in the pauses. She said the show was going to be the biggest moment in their company's history. Everything was being staged around it. Investors, press, international buyers, the whole ecosystem of luxury validation. And if anything disrupted it, the impact wouldn't just be embarrassment, it would be structural. That was the first time the idea formed in my head, not as revenge the way people usually think of it, but as exposure, like forcing reality into a space that had been carefully designed to avoid it. I started paying closer attention to something I had always observed but never really focused on: how my ostriches react to familiarity and disruption. They don't forget scent patterns. They don't ignore territorial boundaries. And once they associate something with their environment, they respond to it in a very direct, physical way. It's not aggression for no reason. It's recognition taken seriously. And I started thinking, what would happen if the stolen material, the thing taken from my land, ended up in the exact place where it was being celebrated as luxury, surrounded by the people who had built a narrative on top of it? The answer wasn't something I wrote down. It was something I understood instinctively. And once I understood it, I couldn't unsee it. So I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. Not Clara, not anyone working for me, not even the people closest to my operation. I selected 12 of my strongest breeding ostriches, not random animals, but the ones that were most alert, most reactive, the ones you respect a little more because you know they are always paying attention. I arranged transport under the cover of a livestock demonstration partnership, something legitimate enough on paper that nobody asked too many questions. And at the same time, I watched Maison Belen prepare for their runway show from a distance, seeing it grow more polished and more fragile at the same time, like something beautiful that was starting to rely too heavily on the idea that nothing could interrupt it. Clara called me the night before the event. She didn't ask me what I was planning, because I think she already knew the answer wouldn't change anything. She just said, "Once this starts, you can't take it back." And I told her I wasn't trying to take anything back. I was just trying to make sure that when everything happened, it couldn't be explained away as bad luck. The day of the Maison Valin runway show felt almost offensive in how normal it looked. That's the part I remember most clearly. Not chaos, not tension, but normality. The kind of clean, polished normal that expensive brands are so good at manufacturing. Outside the venue, cars were pulling up in steady rhythm, doors opening, cameras flashing, guests stepping out like they were entering something historic. Inside, everything was timed down to the second. Lighting calibrated, music rehearsed, staff moving with that controlled urgency that only shows like this seem to produce. It was a machine built for perfection, and for a few minutes, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Models stepped onto the runway wearing gowns that looked almost unreal under the lights. Flowing, structured, designed to catch attention without ever revealing the effort behind them. And I sat far enough away to see everything but close enough to recognize what I was looking at, because I knew those feathers, not as abstract material, not as design elements, but as things that had come from my land, my care, my process. I remember thinking how strange it is that something can travel so far from where it started and still carry traces of its origin, even when nobody in the room wants to acknowledge it. Dorian was there near the front, dressed perfectly, smiling like the entire evening was already a confirmation of everything he believed about himself. The kind of smile people wear when they think they've already won, before they've actually faced any consequences. Clara, I later learned, was backstage trying to hold production together as small issues started piling up. Timing shifts, communication gaps, things that felt minor individually but together created pressure. And then the moment everything stopped pretending to be controlled arrived. I still don't know what triggered it first, whether it was sound, movement, or scent. But when the transport gates opened and the 12 ostriches were finally introduced into the space near the venue, the entire atmosphere changed instantly. They didn't rush in blindly at first. They paused, they observed, heads high, bodies tense, scanning the environment like they were processing something familiar that didn't belong where it was. And then one of them reacted. That single moment of recognition was enough, because what they were seeing wasn't just a random environment. It was fragments of their world, their material, their scent patterns, transformed and displayed as luxury. And once that connection was made, everything followed in a chain that no one there was prepared to interrupt. The controlled entrances near the staging area gave way first, not in some cinematic explosion, but in real physical force. Glass panels cracking under impact as confusion turned into movement. Security tried to respond, but by the time they understood what was happening, the situation was already beyond instruction. Inside the runway hall, the show didn't even get the chance to properly pause. Guests stood up in confusion, models froze mid-step, and the music kept playing for a few seconds too long before someone finally cut it off like they were waking up from a dream. The contrast was almost surreal. High-fashion lighting still shining over a space that was rapidly turning into something uncontrollable. People started shouting over each other, not understanding whether this was staged performance art or catastrophic failure. And in the middle of it, Dorian stood up, trying to assert control with a phone in his hand, voice cracking in a way that didn't match the confidence he had carried for so long. I stayed where I was, watching from a distance, not celebrating, not cheering, just witnessing something reach its natural breaking point after being pushed too far for too long. And when Dorian finally managed to call me, his voice barely stable, he shouted that my ostriches were destroying everything he had built. I remember answering him quietly, without raising my voice, and saying, "They aren't destroying anything that wasn't already built on something taken from someone else." There was a silence after that, not on my end, but in the way he responded, like he was trying to find a version of reality where that sentence didn't apply to him. By the time it ended, the event was shut down completely, guests were evacuated, and what was supposed to be the defining moment of Maison Valin's season had collapsed into something no one could reframe into marketing. In the days that followed, the story spread fast, faster than anyone involved could control. Some people called it chaos, others called it justice, and some tried to turn it into performance commentary about unpredictability in luxury spaces. But underneath all of that noise, the consequences were very real. Investigations started, financial records were reviewed, supply chains were questioned, and the missing materials that had once been dismissed as minor discrepancies turned into something much harder to explain away. Lawsuits followed, contracts were terminated, and investors pulled out quickly once the story stopped being rumor and started becoming documentation. Dorian's version of control didn't survive contact with accountability. Clara eventually stepped away completely from Maison Balan. And when she came back to me later, it wasn't as someone trying to salvage a partnership under pressure, but as someone who had finally seen the full shape of what had been happening. We rebuilt things slowly, properly this time, with terms that couldn't be rewritten by a single person's ambition. As for me, I went back to the ranch, back to the land, back to the animals that never asked for any of this to become a story. But something had changed in the way I saw everything around me, because once you've seen how quickly a polished world can collapse when the truth enters it, you stop trusting surfaces the same way. And even now, I still think about it sometimes, not with pride, not with anger, but with a kind of uncomfortable clarity about how fragile systems become when they forget where value actually comes from. I'll leave it there, because I'm curious what you think after hearing all of this. Was it justice finally catching up, or did it cross a line that shouldn't have been crossed? And if you were in my position, what would you have done differently?